After World War II, thousands of German officers and wartime collaborators from France, Croatia, and many other parts of Europe were faced with a grim reality. The war had ended in defeat, their regime had collapsed, and the Allies were determined to hold the guilty accountable for their actions. The Nuremberg trials were already underway, and the chances of escaping justice within Europe were slim. For these men, there was no safety left in their homeland or anywhere nearby on the continent. They needed a place where they could vanish, where their pasts could be buried under new identities, and where sympathetic powers might protect them. What makes this story fascinating is not that they ran away, since that was expected, but why so many of them chose Argentina as their new home. When Allied flags were raised in Berlin, and the German surrender was signed on May 8, 1945, it became clear to these fugitives that staying in Europe would eventually lead to arrest. Yet while the German regime had collapsed, the networks of sympathy and admiration for it had not completely disappeared. There were still influential men across Europe who believed in the cause, or at least felt enough sympathy to help the escapees. Spain under Francisco Franco became one of the most important bridges for their flight. Officially, Spain was neutral during the war, but Franco had shown friendliness toward Germany, and his regime had only recently emerged from its own devastating civil war. This made Spain a tired neutral nation, but also a safe spot for fugitives seeking to move on elsewhere. Switzerland, too, had individuals in powerful positions who had spoken favorably of Germany and were willing to lend support. Even some members of the Catholic Church stepped in to aid these men, offering shelter and assistance. High-ranking officials in Rome and other cities discreetly smoothed the path of escape, often by providing false documents or connections that could get fugitives onto ships heading out of Europe. For those desperate to flee, time was short. Every passing day made it more likely that Allied intelligence or local authorities would close in on them. The only viable solution was to seek safety far across the ocean, in places where Allied power was weaker and where sympathizers and governments might shield them. Argentina under President Juan Domingo Perón quickly became the most appealing destination. Perón admired aspects of the German ideology of that time, and his administration actively worked to help fugitives escape. Argentine diplomats and intelligence agents based in Europe coordinated routes for their passage. Many of these escape lines led from Spain or Italy to Buenos Aires. Argentina was an especially logical choice because of its cultural and ethnic ties to Europe. A former Spanish colony, Argentina had long received waves of immigrants from Italy and Germany throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. By the time of World War II, a large percentage of Argentines were of Spanish, Italian, or German descent. These communities created natural cultural links with Axis countries. The German government had cultivated these ties as well. During the war, many German spies operated out of Argentina, and a number of Argentine officials and diplomats had served in European capitals where they interacted closely with Axis powers. Perón himself had once worked as a military observer, Italy during the late 1930s, and came away impressed with aspects of Italian militarization. This history explains why Argentina openly admired certain totalitarian behaviors, such as large military parades, strict order, and centralized authority. Influential businessmen and politicians in Argentina also openly sympathized with the Axis cause and welcomed the fugitives as potential allies. Though Argentina officially declared war on Germany and Italy in March 1945, this came only a month before the conflict ended and was mostly symbolic. Behind the scenes, Argentine agents and networks continued to help German officers escape. Money was another crucial factor. Wealthy Germans as well as Argentine businessmen of German descent were willing to finance the escape routes. By paying bribes to border guards arranging ships or securing forged documents, they smoothed the passage of many fugitives across the Atlantic. But politics also played an enormous role. In 1945, many leaders across the world believed that another major conflict was already on the horizon, this time between the capitalist United States and the communist Soviet Union. Perón and his advisors were convinced that a showdown was inevitable. and Argentina could rise as a powerful neutral third force, tipping the balance between East and West. Bringing in German officers, scientists, and experts who were both fiercely anti-communist and technologically skilled seemed like a valuable investment. Perón imagined that they could strengthen Argentina's military and contribute to industrial and scientific progress. This was not an unusual idea. The United States had already begun recruiting German scientists in what became known as Operation Paperclip, while the Soviet Union similarly captured German expertise to advance its own projects. In that sense, Argentina was following the same logic as the superpowers, even if on a smaller scale. For the fugitives, Argentina offered what they most wanted: a place where they could live hidden, or even openly a place where their anti-communist stance gave them political value. Yet with time, this dream began to fade. The Cold War dragged on, and Argentina never emerged as the decisive third power that Perón had envisioned. Support for harboring fugitives slowly diminished. After Perón's government was overthrown in 1955, the new leadership was far less sympathetic. Many feared that the presence of war criminals in the country could bring international shame or even pressure from Europe. Although many fugitives had already settled into Argentine life, the climate grew less welcoming. By the 1990s, most of these men were old and living quietly, often under their real names. Some were finally discovered and extradited to face long-delayed trials in Europe. Others disappeared into the large German-Argentine community, blending into everyday life and never speaking of their past again. Argentina was not the only South American refuge. Brazil, Chile, Paraguay, and other nations also became homes to German fugitives. Hundreds, if not thousands, spread across the continent, building small communities where they could live in relative anonymity. What connected them all was a system of organized escape routes known as ratlines. These routes often passed through Spain or Italy and then moved fugitives onto ships bound for South America. The Catholic Church played a role in some of these operations, as did sympathetic officials in neutral states. Geography made Latin America a uniquely attractive option. Looking at a world map in 1945, Europe was saturated with Allied control. To the east stood the Soviet Union and war-torn Asia. Africa remained dominated by British and French colonies. North America was firmly in the hands of the United States and Canada, both of which were determined to hunt down Axis criminals. Only Latin America presented a region where fugitives could plausibly start fresh lives without immediate fear of extradition. Argentina, with its openness and cultural ties, was the jewel among these options. In the end, the arrival of German officers and collaborators in Argentina tells us as much about global politics after 1945 as it does about the fugitives themselves. Their escape was made possible by a mixture of sympathizers still loyal to the Axis cause, by church networks willing to help them hide, by businessmen who funded their flight, and by political leaders like Juan Perón, who saw in them a potential resource for the coming Cold War. For the fugitives, Argentina was more than just a place to hide. It was a land of opportunity, a chance to reinvent themselves and to bury their past in the shadow of new identities. Some of them never faced justice and lived quietly until death. Others were hunted down decades later, their names resurfacing, as international investigators tracked them to small towns in the Argentine countryside. But for all of them, Argentina represented a remarkable chance of survival in a world that otherwise had no place for them.